The pieces in this second set of Christmas readings are taken from the 20th century, or close to it. First, selections from the Peterkins Christmas Tree, a chapter from my favorite children's stories, after Winnie the Pooh and Wind in the Willows, of course. From Lucretia P. Hale's The Peterkin Papers, from the very late 19th century. The Peterkins Christmas Tree. Early in the autumn, the Peterkins began to prepare for their Christmas tree. Everything was done in great privacy, as it was to be a surprise to the neighbors as well as to the rest of the family. Mr. Peterkin had been up to Mr. Bromwick's woodlot, and with his consent selected the tree. Agamemnon went to look at it occasionally after dark, and Solomon John made frequent visits to it mornings just after sunrise. Mr. Peterkin drove Elizabeth Eliza and her mother that way and pointed furtively to it with his whip, but none of them ever spoke of it aloud to each other. It was suspected that the little boys had been to see it Wednesday and Saturday afternoons, but they came home with their pockets full of chestnuts and said nothing about it. At length Mr. Peterkin had it cut down and brought secretly into the Larkins' barn. A week or two before Christmas, a measurement was made of it with Elizabeth Eliza's yard measure. To Mr. Peterkin's great dismay, it was discovered that it was too high to stand in the back parlor. This fact was brought out at a secret council of Mr. and Mrs. Peterkin, Elizabeth Eliza, and Agamemnon. Agamemnon suggested that it might be set up slanting, but Mrs. Peterkin was very sure it would make her dizzy, and the candles would drip. But a brilliant idea came to Mr. Peterkin. He proposed that the ceiling of the parlor should be raised to make room for the top of the tree. Elizabeth Eliza thought the space would need to be quite large. It must not be like a small box, or you could not see the tree. "Yes," said Mr. Peterkin, "I should have the ceiling lifted all across the room. The effect would be finer." Elizabeth Eliza objected to having the whole ceiling raised because her room was over the back parlor, and she would have no floor while the alteration was going on, which would be very awkward. Besides, her room was not very high now, and if the floor were raised, perhaps she could not walk in it upright. Mr. Peterkin explained that he didn't propose altering the whole ceiling, but to lift up a ridge across the room at the back part where the tree was to stand. This would make a hump, to be sure, in Elizabeth Eliza's room, but it would go across the whole room. Elizabeth Eliza said she would not mind that. On consulting the carpenter, however, he insisted that the tree could be cut off at the lower end to suit the height of the parlor, and demurred at so great a change as altering the ceiling. But Mr. Peterkin had set his mind upon the improvement, and Elizabeth Eliza had cut her carpet in preparation for it. So the folding doors into the back parlor were closed, and for nearly a fortnight before Christmas there was a great litter of fallen plastering and laths and chips and shavings. And Elizabeth Eliza's carpet was taken up, and the furniture had to be changed, and one night she had to sleep at the Bromwicks, for there was a long hole in her floor that might be dangerous. All this delighted the little boys. They could not understand what was going on. Perhaps they suspected a Christmas tree, but they did not know why a Christmas tree should have so many chips, and were still more astonished at the hump that appeared in Elizabeth Eliza's room. It must be a Christmas present, or else the tree in a box. Some aunts and uncles, too, arrived a day or two before Christmas with some small cousins. These cousins occupied the attention of the little boys, and there was a great deal of whispering and mystery behind doors and under the stairs and in the corners of the entry. The afternoon before Christmas, Elizabeth Eliza, Solomon John, and their father collected in the back parlor for a council. The carpenters had done their work, and the tree stood at its full height at the back of the room, the top stretching up into the space arranged for it. All the chips and shavings were cleared away, and it stood on a neat box. But what were they to put upon the tree? After all her trips into town, Elizabeth Eliza had forgotten to bring anything for it. "I thought of candies and sugar plums," she said, "but I concluded if we made caramels ourselves, we should not need them. But then we have not made any caramel. Fact is that day my head was full of my carpet. I had bumped it pretty badly, too. It is odd I should have forgotten that day I went in on purpose to get the things," said Elizabeth Eliza, musingly. "But I went from shop to shop and didn't know exactly what to get. I saw a great many gilt things for Christmas trees, but I knew the little boys were making the gilt apples. There were plenty of candles in the shops, but I knew Solomon John was making the candles. Mr. Peterkin thought it was quite natural. Solomon John wondered if it were too late for them to go into town now." At this moment there was a loud knocking at the front door. The little boys and the small cousins and the uncles and aunts and Mrs. Peterkin hastened to see what was the matter. The uncles and aunts thought somebody's house must be on fire. The door was opened, and there was a man, white with flakes, for it was beginning to snow, and he was pulling in a large box. Mrs. Peterkin supposed it contained some of Elizabeth Eliza's purchases, so she ordered it to be pushed into the back parlor and hastily called back her guests and the little boys into the other room. The little boys and the small cousins were sure that they had seen Santa Claus himself. Mr. Peterkin lighted the gas. The box was addressed to Elizabeth Eliza. It was from the lady in Philadelphia. She had gathered a hint from Elizabeth Eliza's letters that there was to be a Christmas tree, and had filled this box with all that would be needed. It was opened directly. There was every kind of gilt hanging thing, from gilt pea pods to butterflies on springs. There were shining flags and lanterns and bird cages and nests with birds sitting on them, baskets of fruit, gilt apples and bunches of grapes, and at the bottom of the whole, a large box of candles and a box of Philadelphia bonbons. Elizabeth Eliza and Solomon John could scarcely keep from screaming. The little boys and the small cousins knocked on the folding doors to ask what was the matter. Hastily, Mr. Peterkin and the rest took out the things and hung them on the tree and put on the candles. When all was done, it looked so well that Mr. Peterkin exclaimed, "Let us light the candles now and send to invite all the neighbors tonight and have the tree on Christmas Eve." And so it was that the Peterkins had their Christmas tree the day before, and on Christmas night could go and visit their neighbors.